He had locked the world out for years. A cabin in the woods, no visitors, no noise, just silence and the ghosts of fire. But that morning, something changed. 7 sunken bodies in a pit near the pine sand, one broken Labrador who still tried to wag his tail. He didn't bark, he didn't cry. He just looked up at the man with eyes that whispered, "Please, not again." What followed would turn a grieving soul into a guardian and a forgotten dog into the reason the sun rose again. Sunny's Rise. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far Sunny's journey travels. Ethan Walker hadn't planned on being anyone's savior. Not after the fire. Not after burying everything he loved beneath ash and silence. But grief doesn't ask permission, and healing, well, it often shows up uninvited. That morning, like every morning for the past 8 years, Ethan followed the same winding trail behind his cabin in the Blue Ridge Woods. He knew every curve, every rustling pine, every worn patch of earth beneath his boots. But that day, something was off. The birds weren't singing. The breeze had stilled. And the smell, something chemical, something wrong, clung to the air like a warning. That's when he saw the pit. Shallow, jagged, hidden under a layer of leaves. At first, it looked like garbage. Then, a twitch, a paw, a whimper that barely pierced the stillness. Ethan froze, then dropped to his knees. There, half buried in dirt and blood, was a yellow Labrador with ribs like piano keys and eyes too tired to blink. The dog didn't flinch. He simply reached his head forward an inch, maybe less, and let out the softest sigh Ethan had ever heard. It was the sound of someone who'd stopped asking to be saved, but still hoped. The late October air in Blue Ridge, North Carolina, had turned crisp, with a hint of frost clinging to the edges of the pines. A quiet fog hovered just above the ground, curling low around the trees like smoke from an unseen fire. The sun struggled to rise through a dull, overcast sky, casting long silver shafts across the damp forest floor. It had rained the night before, leaving the earth soft and the leaves slick underfoot. The mountains stood silent, watching, waiting. Ethan Walker, 54, moved through the underbrush with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had grown used to silence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands like worn leather and a permanent squint in his steel blue eyes from years of squinting into sunlight and smoke. His graying beard was uneven, as though it had been trimmed more by fire than by shears, and his face bore the quiet resolve of someone who had known both heat and loss. Years ago, Ethan had been a firefighter in Raleigh until the fire that took his wife and daughter. Since then, he'd retreated to the edge of the world, buying a small log cabin nestled deep in the woods of Blue Ridge, where neighbors were a mile apart and grief could echo without interruption. Every morning, Ethan followed the same trail behind his home, axe slung over his shoulder, looking for fallen limbs to chop for firewood. It was a ritual he clung to, a task that gave the silence some shape. On this morning, the forest should have been filled with the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves, but something was wrong. The trees seemed to be holding their breath. The air, usually scented with pine and loam, carried a sharp, metallic edge like old blood or rusted nails. He slowed as he neared the bend in the trail, just before the ravine where the land dipped steeply near a cluster of dying hemlocks. That's when he heard a sound so faint it might have been imagined. A whimper. Soft, desperate. Not the cry of a deer or raccoon, but something more familiar. Canine. Ethan paused, heart beginning to drum in his chest. He stepped carefully off the path, following the sound to a thick patch of underbrush. He pushed through with a grunt and found himself standing at the edge of a shallow pit, no more than 3 feet deep and 6 feet wide, dug crudely into the muddy earth. And inside he froze. 7 dogs. All of them were yellow labs, their coats dulled and matted with dirt, some barely moving, others limp like discarded rags. Ribs protruded through thin skin, their eyes sunken, and several showed signs of old wound cuts, burns, bruises. One lay completely still, mouth open, tongue gray. Another lifted its head weakly, then let it fall again. Ethan's breath caught. His body moved before thought could catch up. He dropped to one knee beside the pit and gently reached in. The first dog he touched flinched, its skin twitching as though expecting pain. But there was no growl, no snap, just resignation. Among them, one dog, the smallest, caught Ethan's eye. It was lying half-buried beneath the others, its body twisted awkwardly, one front paw stretched outward as if reaching. Its eyes, large and honey brown, locked with his. It didn't move, didn't bark, but it blinked slowly, deliberately, and let out a single shallow breath, a near-silent plea. "Jesus," Ethan muttered under his breath. "What the hell happened to you?" Without wasting another second, he pulled his phone from his coat pocket and called the only person he trusted in town, Dr. Rachel Moore. Rachel, 41, was the town's sole veterinarian and had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from growing up on a ranch outside Asheville. She had a lean, wiry build, sharp hazel eyes, and dark curly hair, always tied back in a messy bun. Years of working with injured animals and distrusting humans had made her efficient, dryly funny, and almost pathologically calm in emergencies. She picked up on the first ring. "It's Ethan. I've got dogs, 7, bad shape, abandoned. I need your help." There was a beat of silence then. "Location?" "About a quarter-mile behind my cabin, near the hemlock drop." "I'll be there in 10. Don't move them yet." But Ethan was already moving. He returned to the pit with a shovel from his truck and dug the edges wider, careful not to injure the dogs any further. It took him 45 minutes to lift each one out, cradling them in a blanket he kept in the back seat. They were feather light, which only made the whole thing worse. Once he had them in the truck bed, he laid them side by side, covering them with another blanket and stuffing in old towels as padding. The little one, the one with the pleading eyes, placed in the passenger seat, wrapped in his flannel jacket. By the time Rachel arrived at the clinic, Ethan was already pulling into the gravel lot, his hands shaking on the wheel, knuckles white. "What the hell?" she whispered when she saw the truck bed. "Get them inside, all of them." They moved like a triage unit. Rachel's vet tech, a quiet young man named Colby, helped carry the limp bodies inside, while Rachel administered fluids and checked for signs of poisoning or internal injury. Ethan hovered, unsure where to stand, unsure what to say. He didn't know these dogs, didn't even like dogs, not really. But in that pit, something in him had stirred something he hadn't felt since the day he watched his world burn. The little one, lying on the exam table, blinked up at him again. Ethan reached out and placed a rough hand gently on its head. Its eyes closed. "You're gonna be all right," he whispered. "I promise." And for the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan meant it. The clinic was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of movement from the recovery room. Outside, the skies over Blue Ridge had darkened to a pale pewter, hinting at another round of rain. Inside, the scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the earthy musk of damp fur. Ethan Walker sat slumped in a metal chair by the window, flannel sleeves rolled up, arms crossed tight against his chest. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived, not that anyone expected him to. Dr. Rachel Moore, still in her navy blue scrubs, moved efficiently between kennels, checking IV lines and administering antibiotics. Her brow was furrowed in quiet frustration. She was used to emergency scar accidents, broken bones, a snake bite now and then, but this, 7 near-dead dogs, all the same breed, all dumped like trash, this was different. She stopped by the kennel nearest the corner, where the smallest of the dogs lay wrapped in a faded wool blanket. The pup's eyes fluttered open when Rachel approached. His breathing was shallow, but steady. One front paw was bandaged, the other twitched when touched. His ribs poked through skin too thin to hide much, and a pink chemical burn ran in a ragged line from shoulder to hip. Yet, despite everything, his eyes wide, amber, full of some quiet, will followed every movement around him. Rachel knelt. "He's the only one that looked at me like he's already forgiven us," she murmured. Ethan, still by the window, looked over. He stood and walked slowly to the kennel, crouching beside her. He stared at the dog for a long time. "He was the last one I pulled out," Ethan said finally. "Didn't bark, didn't move, just looked up, like he'd been waiting for me." Rachel tilted her head. "That one's a fighter. Still can't believe he made the ride over without crashing. His liver enzymes are a mess. Looks like he ingested something caustic." Ethan reached a hand into the kennel. The dog didn't flinch. In fact, he nudged his nose forward, brushing Ethan's wrist, and let out a faint puff of breath. Not quite a sigh. More like permission. Ethan swallowed hard. "Sunny," he said. Rachel glanced at him. "What?" "His name," Ethan replied. "Sunny, because somehow he's still trying to shine." Rachel smiled faintly. "That's poetic. Didn't think you had that in you." "I didn't either." Sunny blinked slowly, as if affirming the name was his now. Rachel scribbled it on a clipboard. As the hours passed, the other dogs showed signs of stabilizing. One female later named Daisy had deep rope burns around her neck, the fur worn raw where she'd clearly been chained. Another, a larger male with cloudy eyes, had a mangled back paw that might never fully heal. One had old burn scars on her flank, likely from exposure to chemicals. Each carried their own signature of cruelty. By late afternoon, the worst of the emergencies had passed, and Rachel took a short break, stepping outside to smoke something she rarely did unless the day had clawed under her skin. Ethan remained inside, sitting cross-legged by Sunny's kennel. For a long time, he just watched the dog breathe. Every slow rise and fall of Sunny's chest seemed to anchor something inside Ethan that had long since drifted. Colby Jennings, Rachel's assistant, walked in holding a fresh IV bag. He was in his 20s, quiet, blonde with an undercut, and had grown up in nearby Franklin. Raised by a single mom and always more comfortable around animals than people, Colby had the kind of gentleness that made frightened dogs relax the moment he touched them. He nodded at Ethan. "He's lucky you found him." "I didn't find him," Ethan muttered. "He found me." Colby smiled faintly and went about replacing the IV. Sunny stirred but didn't resist. Rachel returned a few minutes later and stood beside Ethan. "You know," she said, voice low, "this kind of thing, it's not random, not 7 of them, not all labs. This smells like a backyard breeding operation gone to hell." Ethan didn't answer, but something in his jaw tightened. Rachel continued, "There's been rumors. Dog mill a few towns over. Nothing confirmed. Could be they dumped these guys when they got sick or stopped being profitable." Ethan still didn't respond. He was watching Sunny, who was now attempting to lift his head. The effort was weak, but intentional. "You think he'll make it?" Ethan asked. Rachel took a breath. "If infection doesn't set in, if his kidneys hold up, if we can keep him eating, he's got a shot. But it'll be a long recovery." Ethan nodded slowly, then stood. "What do I need to do?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering for nurse duty?" "I'm not leaving him," Ethan said simply. Rachel didn't challenge that. Instead, she handed him a printed care sheet, detailed feeding notes, and a small bag of medications. "Start with this. I'll get more supplies tomorrow. You've got space?" Ethan thought about the cabin, the long empty guest room, the old dog crate still stored in the shed from years ago. He nodded. "I've got space." That night, under a soft drizzle, Ethan carried Sunny to the passenger seat of his truck, wrapped again in his flannel. The other 6 dogs would remain at the clinic for monitoring, but Sunny barely more than a breath was going home with him. As they drove, the winding road illuminated only by fogged headlights, Ethan looked over at the small yellow head resting beside him. "You held on," he whispered. "Now I will too." And in the darkness, for the first time in 8 years, something inside Ethan Walker didn't feel entirely empty. The cabin had always been quiet. Too quiet. For 8 years, the only sounds had been the creak of old floorboards, the sigh of wind through cracked windows, and the occasional groan of the wood stove settling into its bones. But now, it breathed. It coughed and whimpered and barked. And in the center of it all was Ethan Walker, no longer a ghost, but a man trying, tentatively, to remember what it meant to be needed. Sunny lay on an old patchwork rug in front of the fireplace, his frail body curled into a half-moon of healing fur and bones. Ethan had placed a small bowl of water next to him, along with a blanket that once belonged to his daughter, Ella. The Labrador hadn't touched the water yet, but he had sniffed the edge of the blanket and let out a low huff of contentment, as if recognizing something good in the scent. Ethan moved about the house with a strange urgency. He had cleaned out the mudroom and transformed it into a makeshift recovery space. He covered the floor in rubber mats, laid down layers of thick towels and sleeping pads, and rearranged shelves to make space for supplies. The house that once held only relics of lost photo frames turned face down. Dusty bookshelves, locked doors was slowly filling with signs of life. By mid-morning, Rachel arrived with the other 6 dogs, transported in 2 large crates in the back of her pickup. She stepped out wearing a brown Carhartt jacket, jeans, and a ball cap that had seen better days. Her hair, once tied in a tight bun, was now falling loose in wavy strands around her tired face. She looked at Ethan with something that bordered on admiration and disbelief. "You sure about this?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yeah." "All right then," she said, popping the tailgate. "Let's move 'em in." One by one, they carried the dogs into the cabin, each responding in their own way to the new environment. Daisy, a thin but graceful female with a scar circling her neck like a collar of regret, sniffed cautiously around the room before settling by the window. Boone, the biggest of the group with a thick head and mournful eyes, wouldn't budge from the crate until Ethan coaxed him out with a quiet word and a piece of boiled chicken. Millie, copper-coated and gentle, trembled at every footstep. Copper, a younger male with a torn ear, circled nervously. Ginger, quiet and wide-eyed, followed Ethan from room to room like a shadow. And Max, the oldest, his muzzle silvered, sat down with a sigh, as if he had just ended a long journey. Ethan named them as the day unfolded, the way a parent might name stars, each title offered with care and meaning. By the end of the afternoon, the house echoed with new sounds: tentative claws on hardwood, sloshing water bowls, the deep, exhausted sighs of animals beginning to trust their fate. But night was harder. When the sun dipped below the Blue Ridge horizon and the forest turned dark and unfamiliar, the dogs remembered. Whimpers began to rise from the corners of the cabin. Boone barked sharply at nothing. Millie cowered under the dining table. Max paced in circles, disoriented. Ethan stood helpless at first, unsure of what to say, what to do until he sat down on the living room floor and just listened. He spoke softly into the air. "I know what it's like," he whispered, "to be afraid when the lights go out, to wait for something awful that already happened." His voice cracked. "I know." Sunny, who had been lying beneath Ethan's bed upstairs, came padding down the stairs slowly, his movements still weak but determined. He walked straight to Ethan and lay down beside him, pressing his side gently against the man's leg. The weight was small but grounding, like a tether to something real. That night, Ethan left the bedroom door open. He slept on the floor beside Sunny, and though the nightmares came as they always did, he didn't wake up alone. Sunny, silent and watchful, nuzzled his face and stayed close until the tremors passed. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing at the stove, frying 2 eggs and a strip of bacon not just for himself, but because the cabin no longer felt like it belonged to one man. He put on coffee, fed the dogs carefully measured portions of wet food, and talked to them as he worked. "You eat like you've never seen food before," he told Boone, who wolfed down his meal in under 10 seconds. "Easy now, slow down." Millie crept forward for a head scratch, tentative but hopeful. "Well, look at that," Ethan smiled. "Took you long enough." The dogs didn't answer, but they didn't need to. Their tails thumped. Their eyes met his without fear. Their bodies slowly, gradually, began to rest. By midweek, the house had rhythms again. Mornings were for walks in the fenced-back meadow. Afternoons were for naps on blankets spread beneath the windows. Evenings were quiet, filled with the crackle of the fireplace and the scent of broth simmering on the stove. The dogs still carried their scars. Ethan could feel them, invisible and heavy, but they weren't bleeding anymore. Neither was he. And so the cabin, once a place where time stood still, began to breathe again. The days grew shorter as October deepened into early November. The sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains earlier each evening, painting the sky in streaks of orange and mauve before surrendering to the quiet dark. At Ethan Walker's cabin, life had settled into an unlikely rhythm. 7 dog sonts broken, now healing moved through the house and the fenced backyard with slow confidence, their fear giving way to habit, to familiarity. And yet, one unexpected moment would shift everything, all because of a single photo. It was Rachel Moore's idea. One Sunday morning after a checkup visit, she stood outside the cabin's porch with her phone in hand, watching Ethan kneel beside Sunny while he cleaned a cut on the pup's leg. The dog, though still thin, had gained back strength in his legs. His fur was starting to shine again, and there was light in his eyes. Without warning, Rachel snapped a picture. Ethan glanced up. "You just take my picture?" "I did," she said plainly. "You look like you're doing something right for once." "That's debatable." Rachel smirked. "I'm posting it. People need to see this." "Why?" "Because," she replied, "some stories matter, and yours, this might help someone believe again." She uploaded the photo that night with a short caption. "A man who lost everything, found purpose again in the eyes of a dying dog. Meet Sunny and Ethan. Hope lives here." By Monday afternoon, the post had been shared over 20 times. By Tuesday, people were emailing the clinic asking how they could help. Food, blankets, first aid supplies, chew toys, cleaning materials, began arriving at Ethan's cabin door by the boxload. A retired woman from Georgia mailed handmade dog beds. A college student from Virginia sent bags of premium food. One family even drove 6 hours to leave a care package and wave through the fence. Ethan wasn't sure what to do with all the attention. He didn't want praise. He wasn't a hero. But every time he saw Sunny bark excitedly at the door when a new delivery arrived, or watched Daisy nap in the sun on a bed someone had sewn by hand, he felt something shift. Maybe people still cared. Maybe hope could ripple out from one act. And then, Noah came. It was Rachel who introduced them. She called ahead one Thursday morning, her voice unusually gentle. "Ethan, I've got a favor to ask." "I'm listening." "There's a boy. His name is Noah Reynolds. He's 9. Lives with his grandparents. His left arm didn't fully develop in utero, was born without a hand. He's been through a lot." Ethan was quiet. "And?" He saw the photo. Asked to meet the dog. The yellow one. Sunny. Ethan hesitated. "You think it's a good idea? These dogs aren't exactly—" "I know," she said. "But I think you should meet him." Noah arrived that Saturday just before sunset. He stepped out of his grandfather's rusted red pickup, wearing a navy windbreaker, zipped up to his chin in jeans that were a size too big. He had sandy hair, pale skin freckled from the sun, and large, observant hazel eyes. His left sleeve was tucked into the pocket of his jacket, his right hand gripping a paper bag with careful precision. He didn't say much when he first approached Ethan, just nodded once and said, "Hi, I'm Noah." "Hi, Noah. I'm Ethan." Noah looked around, scanning the yard. "Where's Sunny?" Ethan opened the gate. "He's in the backyard. Come on." As they walked toward the fenced meadow behind the house, Noah stayed quiet, his small legs quick and sure on the gravel path. Sunny was lying under a hickory tree, head on his paws, watching a butterfly circle above him. He perked up the moment he saw Ethanand, then noticed the boy. Noah crouched down a few feet away, not reaching, just watching. Sunny stood slowly and walked toward him, pausing inches away, sniffing the boy's shoes. Then, gently, he leaned forward and nudged Noah's chest with his nose. The boy didn't move. Then he smiled. "He's soft," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "He's stubborn too," Ethan added, "but he's a good dog." Noah reached into his paper bag and pulled out a dog treat, holding it carefully in his right hand. Sunny sniffed, then licked it from his palm. Noah laughed. The sound was sudden and clear, like a bell ringing through old trees. From that moment, a strange and beautiful rhythm began. Every Saturday, Noah would visit. His grandfather, Walter Reynolds, a stoic man in his 70s with a white beard and a limp from an old logging accident, would sit in the truck reading the paper while Noah played with Sunny and the others. Ethan observed the boy carefully each time. Noah didn't demand affection. He didn't run. He simply sat near the dogs, sometimes throwing a ball, sometimes just lying in the grass beside Sunny, both of them blinking up at the sky in perfect silence. They were different, Ethan realized, but the same in all the ways that mattered. Both had been hurt, both had lost something, and both were still choosing somehow to trust again. One Saturday near dusk, after Noah had brushed Sunny and tucked him in with a blanket, he turned to Ethan and said, "Do you think dogs remember?" Ethan knelt beside him. "I think they do, but not the way we do, not just the bad things. They remember kindness too." Noah nodded. "I think Sunny remembers me now. I think you're right." That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and the air turned gold, Ethan stood on the porch, listening to the sounds of the houseladder, panting, tails thumping against wood. And then, from somewhere in the distance, a single bark rang out, then another and another. They weren't cries for help. They weren't warnings. They were joy, a sound the mountains hadn't heard in a long, long time. The frost came early that week. The Blue Ridge mornings were stiff with silence, leaves frozen into delicate sculptures along the edge of the porch, and the breath of every living creature hung in the air like smoke. Inside the cabin, Ethan Walker stirred a pot of bone broth, letting its warmth fill the house. The dogs had grown used to the cold, curling up near the fire or sunning themselves in whatever narrow patches of light spilled through the windows. Sunny had been quieter than usual. Over the past few days, Ethan noticed the Labrador's steps growing slower, his appetite faltering. At first, he blamed it on the weather, or maybe exhaustion after all. The dog had come back from the edge once already. But that morning, something shifted. It happened just after dawn. Ethan had taken his usual mug of coffee out to the front porch, where Sunny often liked to sit at his feet and watch the fog roll in from the valley. But this time, Sunny didn't come. Ethan called softly, but there was no answer. A spike of unease pierced his chest. He set the mug down and walked into the bedroom. Sunny was lying near the bed, legs splayed out awkwardly, chest rising in shallow, irregular breaths. His eyes blinked slow, and as Ethan stepped closer, the dog tried to lift his head, but failed. Then came the cough, sudden and violent, rattling from deep within. It sounded wet, dangerous, a terrible echo of something old, something forgotten but unfinished. "Sunny," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside him. The dog didn't respond, just stared with dulled eyes. Ethan didn't wait. He scooped Sunny into a wool blanket, arms trembling with urgency, and drove with white knuckles down the mountain road to Rachel's clinic. The sky had turned a sickly gray, mirroring his gut. The tires skidded on patches of ice near a bend, but he didn't slow down. Rachel Moore was already prepping for surgery on another animal when Ethan burst through the front doors. "He's coughing, collapsed," "I think it's bad," Ethan said breathlessly, his voice cracking in the middle. Rachel's eyes widened, and she immediately took the blanket from his arms. She laid Sunny on the exam table and went to work checking vitals, drawing blood, listening to his lungs. Her face grew more serious with every passing minute. Colby Jennings, her assistant, hovered in the corner, handing Rachel tools without being asked. Even he sensed this wasn't just another case. Finally, Rachel straightened and met Ethan's gaze. "It's not an infection," she said gently. "It's his liver, the damage from the original poisoning. We knew it was bad, but I think it's worse than we thought. The toxins left behind are breaking things down. This is a relapse, Ethan." Ethan leaned back against the wall, hands on his knees, breath heavy. He felt the world tilt beneath him. "Can you fix it?" he asked, quietly. Rachel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's treatment. Aggressive. 4. Fluids. Meds for the liver. Anti-nausea. Oxygen if needed. But it's risky and expensive." "I don't care," Ethan said, the words out before he even thought them. "Just do it." Rachel put a hand on his arm steady, strong. "We'll do everything we can." They admitted Sunny into the back recovery room, where the lights buzzed softly and the machines beeped in intervals too rhythmic to be comforting. Ethan sat by his side, one hand resting gently on Sunny's side, feeling each shallow breath as though it were his own. He didn't speak for a long time, didn't move, just listened to the machines, to the faint clicks of Rachel moving about the clinic. The hours passed like a dream you don't want to wake up from. Sometime after midnight, when the room was lit only by a single overhead bulb, Ethan leaned down and whispered into Sunny's ear. "You're the reason I get up every morning," he said, voice low, rough with grief. "I didn't know it until now. You're it, Sunny. You're the piece I didn't know I was missing." Sunny opened his eyes. They were tired, glassy, but they focused on Ethan, and then just once his tail thumped softly against the blanket. "It was enough," Ethan cried, the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep to name. His shoulders shook silently, and he covered his eyes, ashamed even as it spilled out of him. He hadn't cried when his wife died. Not at the funeral. Not when they lowered his daughter's small casket into the ground. But this broke something open. Rachel walked in sometime after 2 a.m. She saw him there, head bowed beside the sleeping dog, tears drying on his weathered face. She didn't interrupt. She just placed a new IV bag on the stand, adjusted Sunny's monitor, and left the room without a word. The rest of the night passed in fragments. Ethan didn't sleep. He kept a steady hand on Sunny's side, whispering stories from the firehouse, from hikes he once took, from the silly things Ella used to say about dogs with big ears. And when the sun finally rose, weak and pale behind frost-streaked windows, Sunny was still breathing. Still here. The clinic's recovery room smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol, warm dog fur, and the steel tang of hope. It had been 4 days since Sunny's collapse. 4 long nights of IV drips, liver supplements, and prayers whispered into sterile air. And now, as Ethan Walker sat beside the cot, gently rubbing the Labrador's head, he felt something shift subtle, but real. Sunny blinked slowly and lifted his chin an inch higher than the day before. That was enough. Ethan stood, cracked his knuckles, and whispered, "We've got work to do." Later that afternoon, while Ethan loaded a new bag of kibble into his truck, Rachel approached with a printed envelope in her hand. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, glasses sliding down her nose, and her voice had that clipped calm she used when about to say something important. "You got a visitor," she said, handing him the envelope. "From the ASPA, Animal Safety and Protection Alliance. Based out of Chapel Hill. They saw your story online and want to talk." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Rachel shrugged. "They didn't say, but if I had to guess, justice." The next day, A forest green SUV pulled up outside the cabin. From it stepped Callie Denton, a woman in her early 40s with sharp gray eyes, sun-leathered skin, and the quiet determination of someone who'd spent years knocking on doors people didn't want to open. Callie wore jeans, a canvas field jacket, and a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and no small talk. "Mr. Walker, you mind if we talk inside?" Ethan led her to the porch, where Sunny lay curled in the sun. The Labrador looked up but didn't move, his energy still fragile. Callie knelt, not to shake hands, but to press her fingers gently to the dog's side. "This him?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Sunny." She stood slowly. "I've seen dogs rescued from traps, hoarding dens, even the back of trucks in 100-degree heat, but I've never seen a dog like him still wag his tail after what he's been through." Ethan glanced down. "He didn't wag it much last week." Callie got to the point. She opened her satchel and pulled out a folder filled with reports, maps, and surveillance photos. "We've been following reports of illegal breeding operations in western North Carolina, especially around Asheville and the surrounding counties. We've known for a while something bad was happening up there, but no one's been willing to talk." She paused. "Until your story hit the internet." Ethan frowned. "You think Sunny and the others came from one of these places?" Callie nodded. "There's a property in Black Mountain, just off Highway 70. Former boarding kennel. Shut down 5 years ago. Sold cheap. No inspection records since. Neighbors report hearing dogs at night, but every time we visit, the place looks abandoned." Ethan's voice hardened. "What do you need?" "We need someone who saw what happens when animals are discarded. Someone with nothing to gain but the truth. Someone who won't look away." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let's go." 2 days later, under gray skies and armed with a warrant, Ethan joined Callie, 2 ASPA agents, and the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department on a quiet raid. They approached the compound at dawn, an old cinder block building covered in ivy and mold, its windows blacked out. The smell hit first: ammonia, rot, and the unmistakable stench of filth and fear. Inside, they found cages stacked floor to ceiling. Over 40 dogs. Most were Labradors, though there were a few shepherds, boxers, and mixed breeds. The dogs were terrified tails tucked, ears flat, fur missing in patches. Many had scars. A few had fresh wounds. None had names. One cage, rusted at the hinges, held a yellow lab with the same honey-brown eyes as Sunny. When Ethan knelt beside her, she crawled forward and rested her chin on his boot. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The rescue team worked for hours, cataloging each animal, documenting conditions, and beginning medical triage. Several dogs were rushed to nearby clinics. Others were placed in temporary shelters. The man who owned the property, Reed Mathers, a lean, hawk-faced man in his 50s with slicked-back gray hair and an air of greasy defiance, was arrested on site. He said nothing except, "They're just dogs. What's the big deal?" Ethan looked him in the eye and replied, "They trusted you. That's the big deal." Weeks later, Ethan was called to testify. The courtroom in Asheville was modest, its wood-paneled walls giving the space a warmth that felt out of place for what was being discussed. Ethan wore a borrowed jacket, his calloused hands folded stiffly in his lap. Sunny stayed at home, still recovering, but his story entered the courtroom long before Ethan did. When he took the stand, the prosecutor asked, "Can you tell the court what you found that morning?" Ethan's voice was calm, measured. But when he described the pit, the whimpers, the weight of Sunny in his arms, there wasn't a sound in the room. No one shifted. No one coughed. "And what would you like to say to the man who did this?" Ethan turned his head toward Reed Mathers, who sat slouched at the defendant's table, arms crossed. "I don't hate you," Ethan said quietly. "I don't want revenge, but I hope you learn something before this ends. Life any life isn't trash you throw away when it's inconvenient. It's a promise you either honor or you break." Mathers looked away. The judge, A woman named Marilyn Whitaker, mid-60s, tall, with silver hair pinned in a low twist, leaned forward. "You named the dog Sunny?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied. She paused for a moment. "That's the kind of name that expects something better." The courtroom fell silent. Mathers was sentenced to 7 years in state prison for animal cruelty, unlicensed breeding, and neglect. The operation was shut down permanently. The remaining dogs were placed in recovery homes and shelters across the region. As for Ethan, he didn't celebrate. But that night, back at the cabin, he stood on the porch with Sunny beside him, watching the stars appear through the trees. And for the first time in a long time, trust didn't feel like a risk. It felt like a promise being kept. The first snow came early that year, a gentle dusting across the hills of Blue Ridge, painting the pines and rooftops with powdered white. The old cabin that once stood in stillness now stirred with movement, each morning paws scratching across wooden floors, tails thumping against couch legs, water bowls clinking with tongues. And in the middle of it all was Ethan Walker, standing barefoot in the kitchen, cradling a hot mug of coffee as steam curled around his beard. He watched the forest through the frosted window, the world tinted soft gold by the early sun. A letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, one that changed everything. It came in a crisp, white envelope with the seal of the Wellington Foundation, a national nonprofit known for funding rehabilitation programs for both animals and veterans. Rachel had submitted Ethan's story without telling him, along with photos of Sunny, testimonies from neighbors, and a video clip of Ethan testifying in court. The letter was short and direct. "Mr. Walker, we are honored to support the mission that found its roots in your quiet corner of the mountains. Enclosed is a grant to establish a permanent facility for animal rescue and therapeutic care. We hope this is just the beginning." Ethan had read it 3 times before calling Rachel. "You sneaky woman." Rachel just laughed. "You're welcome. Now go build something." And build he did. Over the next month, with help from volunteers and local carpenters, the land behind the cabin was transformed. The old barn, once sagging and forgotten, was rebuilt beam by beam. Fences were reinforced. Heating was installed. Wooden ramps and padded indoor flooring were added for the older or injured dogs. A small annex was built next to the Barntow rooms, one for counseling, one for reading and rest. Ethan didn't call it an office. He called it the Quiet Room. They named it Sunny's Rise. The name was burned into a smooth cedar sign that now stood at the property's entrance. Below it, smaller words read, "A sanctuary for dogs and those who carry invisible wounds." Noah Reynolds was the first to see it. On the morning of the soft opening, he stepped out of his grandfather's truck, wearing his favorite green jacket and a beanie pulled over his ears. His cheeks flushed pink in the cold. He stood before the sign for a long time, running his fingers across the letters, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Ethan. "You spelled it right." Ethan smiled. "Would have been real embarrassing if I didn't." Noah grinned, then bolted through the gates where Sunny was waiting. The Labrador's tail wagged in wide, joyful arcs, and the boy knelt to hug him tightly, burying his face in the soft yellow fur. From that day forward, Noah became the youngest official volunteer at Sunny's Rise. He fed the dogs, cleaned the kennels, helped teach visiting children how to interact gently with animals. His missing hand never slowed him down, not once. He had found a place where he wasn't different, just part of the pack. Ethan hired 2 part-time staff, Debbie Keller, a retired Army medic in her 50s, with a warm smile and a no-nonsense walk, and Mason Burke, a lanky, quiet young man on the spectrum, who had a gift for calming even the most skittish dog with nothing but a look. Both lived nearby and had found their own kind of peace in the work. But it was Sunny who did the real magic. Fully recovered now, his body strong, his coat gleaming, Sunny began visiting local hospitals and therapy centers twice a week. He wore a vest stitched with his name and a small embroidered sun. Patients smiled when he entered the room, Children leaned into his soft fur. Veterans, who had once turned their faces to the wall, whispered to him about things they couldn't tell anyone else. He listened to every word. One afternoon, after a long day of therapy visits, Ethan stood by the barn as the sun set. 10 dogs ran through the fenced field behind him, some chasing balls, others rolling in the snow. A couple lay in the tall grass, basking in the fading light. Every one of them had come from broken beginnings. Every one of them had learned to trust again. Rachel joined him, scarf wrapped high around her neck, hands in her coat pockets. "You did good, Walker." Ethan took a sip from his coffee. "Didn't do it alone." "You did the hardest part," she said. "You stayed when it hurt." He nodded, eyes fixed on Sunny, who was now lying on his back while Noah tickled his belly. For a moment, the world was still. Then, from behind the barn, came a new sound of bark. Then another. 2 more dogs arrived that morning, transported from a crowded shelter near Raleigh. They were thin, nervous, unsure. But they had arrived. Ethan set his coffee down and walked to meet them. That night, the stars came out over Blue Ridge like scattered silver dust. Ethan stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the lights flicker above the pines. He could hear the soft breathing of sleeping dogs, the occasional shuffle of paws against straw, and the distant sound of Noah laughing in his sleep upstairs. He closed his eyes. For years, his mornings had begun in silence. Now they began with the soft rumble of paws, the scent of fresh coffee, and the warmth of a dog pressing its head into his palm. He was no longer alone. The sun would rise again tomorrow. It always did. But this time, it rose for more than just him. Sometimes, the ones we rescue end up rescuing us. Ethan thought he was saving Sunny and the other abandoned dogs, but in truth, they were pulling him back to life. Through pain, silence, and trust slowly rebuilt, Sunny's rise became more than a shelter. It became a testament to the healing power of compassion, resilience, and second chances. The story reminds us that no soul is too broken to be loved, and no past too dark to find light again. Whether human or animal, we all carry scars. But with kindness and connection, even the deepest wounds can become places where hope grows. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share this with someone who needs a reason to believe in second chances. Comment below with one word. Hope let the world know you're still standing for those who can't speak for themselves. Support a local animal shelter or veteran program. Even the smallest gesture can change a life. And remember, sometimes healing begins with a single paw on your chest and a sunrise worth waking up for.